Welcome to the first episode of the Candle and Quill. I'm Father Roderick. I'm a priest, I'm a geek, and I am an author, a storyteller, and I love to share with you my adventures as a storyteller. In this new show, I'm going to give you an update on my weekly writing adventures. I try to write at least a few hours every morning, and sometimes I will go on a walk and just dictate stories into my phone, and then I can transcribe them later. But as you might know, I'm also writing a fantasy novel, my very first fantasy novel. It's a story about monks in the Middle Ages in Ireland. It is a riveting story full of mystery, but also full of magic. And I'm having a blast creating this world and coming up with a story. So every week, I want to give you a short update on how I'm faring with this writing endeavor. But you may also know that I write short stories, and I do that every day. In fact, today, as of this recording time, I have been on Substack for exactly 1 month. I never really saw Substack as a platform that I felt called to use. As you know, I'm very active on YouTube, on TikTok. I'm a podcaster. But Substack felt to me more like a platform for bloggers, and I just didn't feel like there was enough time in a day to blog in addition to all the other media work that I do. But that all changed once I had decided to write a fantasy novel. I will tell you the story of how that came about in a future episode, but suffice it to know that in order to train myself to write better stories, I thought, it's a pretty tough job to write a novel of about 70,000 pages if you don't have any experience in writing fiction. And so, what if I would write a tiny story every single day? It's not even a short story. I've learned that that is all actually called flash fiction. So I started to write a new story every day, and I would post it on Substack. And so in total, as of today, I've written 33 short stories, and they cover a wide range of topics. I started writing stories that take place in the same universe as my fantasy novel, so in medieval Ireland, and that was a lot of fun because it feels like a world that I'm familiar with. I love reading fantasy, and a lot of the epic fantasy and high fantasy takes place in medieval worlds. And so it felt very natural for me to tell stories. And what happened is, while I was creating those short stories, I was also world building. I started to understand the world in which my big story takes place. I started to understand it better. I also started to kind of fill in a lot of the backstory of the characters in my novel, and also the world that we encounter at the beginning of my book. Now, this is a magical version of medieval Ireland. So there is magic, but it is actually a form of magic that we are all familiar with as people who love to read, people who love to watch TV and watch movies. It is called story magic. And in that world, there are monks who travel the country, and wherever people are in need, they use this story magic where they can literally pull people into a story. So the moment they start telling a story, it's as if it's a portal to another world. And inside that story spell, they learn things. They are able to reframe the situation that they're dealing with in real life. And in very rare occasions, the story can also change something in reality. Now, of course, a good story also needs a nemesis. It needs someone who is opposed to the goal of my heroes. And that is a very secretive order of dark mages, and they are trying to poison the stories. They are trying to rob the stories of hope. Now, even though I had a vague idea of how that story worked, I didn't really know how it would practically work in very specific cases. And that's what I've been able to develop in these short stories. Another type of story that I've posted every once in a while are children's stories. And that was actually one of the first genres that I tried out when I started Substack a month ago. This was at the, in the middle of the conclave. So the cardinals had just entered the Sistine Chapel, and the whole world was watching the chimney on top of the Sistine Chapel. And you probably have seen it as well. That chimney stood there not all by itself. No, there was actually a small family of seagulls. So two adult seagulls, and there was a little chick. And they nested on the roof of the Sistine Chapel. And journalists, since they didn't have anything to report on other than, that little chimney, they just went on and on and on about that seagull family. And the question I asked myself is, if those seagulls could talk, what story would they tell? And that's how I came up with a story called the Chick in the Chimney. And I posted that on Substack, and it went viral very rapidly. This is how I got my first 250 subscribers in no time, because that story got picked up, it got reposted. I even got a call from the New York Times, and they wanted to do an interview with me about that story. Now, unfortunately for me, that didn't happen, because while they were planning that story, white smoke appeared, and the news broke that there was a new pope, and he was American, so they just didn't have room for that. But it just showed me how quickly a good story that somehow kind of touches the heart of people can start to amass a crowd and can start building community. And that's why I do this. I want to create a community around storytelling. And so the best way to do that is not to talk about stories, I think at least, but to tell stories. And so then I started to write more and more stories. And over time, I started to see that actually I had two types of stories. I had the fantasy stories, and I had the kind of the children's stories about animals. And then I had this idea, well, what if I take all these short stories and I put them together in a collection of stories, one fantasy stories, and the second book a book for children, telling the history of Rome and also explaining current day Rome and the Vatican, but through the eyes of animals. So each children's story has an animal who is the main protagonist of the story. It was so much fun. And the one thing that I've learned after doing this for, 31 days now, is that daily rhythm was incredible. It just opened, it broke the dam of my creativity. One of the things that I've struggled with in the past, 5 months now that I'm writing this novel, this first fantasy book, is that oftentimes I just get stuck. It's mostly because I don't know where the story is going, and then I have to go back and make another outline. And so there's a lot of iteration in that process. Whereas these short stories, it's usually very simple. It's just one or two characters. There is one problem, and then you have obstacles, and then there is a resolution. And I always try to give it a twist, especially in the fantasy stories. There's always something unexpected that happens. But it's fairly simple to see the structure of the story and then to write it. And so I developed a method that I think I might also be able to apply to my novel. But the way in which I create these short stories is every day I try to establish a routine. So for each story, I reserve about 2 hours. That may seem like a lot, but for me, I try to wake up really early in the morning at 6 o'clock. So I try to do this kind of outside of office hours. So the first thing I do in the morning is I take an idea for a story, and then I start to, kind of remodel it and refine it. However, the idea for that story is something I've recorded the day before. Every afternoon after lunch, so that would be around 1 o'clock, I go out for a walk. I live very close to the woods here, so I just put on my walking boots and I take a walk in the forest, and it's really beautiful. It feels like I'm in the Shire. But I always take my phone with me, and I think about a story, a short story. What can I come up with today? And usually I always find at least one story, but there are times that I have like 4 or 5 ideas. And what I do is I just switch on a recording app on my phone and I start just telling the story as if I'm telling it to you, as if you're walking next to me. And that has been the game changer because I imagine that I'm telling the story to someone else. So there is no iteration. My brain is just like, okay, deliver the story. But I'm not tempted to be too perfectionistic or to make it too like all the refinement is for the editing phase the next morning when I just sit down here in silence in my office and I can just focus on making it pretty. But the most important element is to have that story and to know where it's going and how it ends. And very often I will have an idea, um, and I will just start telling the story, even though I don't know exactly how I'm going to wrap things up, how I'm going to do the ending. And the funny thing is, it always comes together. And sometimes it takes about 45 minutes. There are times where I write a story that may end up only as, what is it, 1,500 words on Substack. But in order to tell that story and to kind of figure out the ending, it takes me 45 minutes to record. But that's not a problem because then what I do is I take that recording and I run it through a transcription app that I have on my computer. And so what I love about that is that I've been basically dictating the story, but there are a lot of pauses where I have to think like, okay, so what's going to happen, and then or ums and silences. The transcription doesn't care. It just writes down every word that I've said. If I'm thinking, it won't show up in the transcript. And so every morning, I already have like a rough draft of my story. And then it all comes down to kind of condensing it, taking out what is, not relevant. And sometimes I will just have to work a little bit on the ending. And then I post it on Substack. I add a picture, and that's it. That's what I've been doing. But since I've been gathering these short stories into 2 anthologies, I have word count on, and I know that for the children's book, I'm kind of at the halfway point now, or even past the halfway point. I'm aiming for a children's book of about 20,000 words, which for a children's book is okay. There are going to be some illustrations as well. For the fantasy anthology, I want to write at least 40, 50,000 words. And the way I do this is I have all these short stories, and I'm also working on a kind of a frame. So it's a frame narrative about this tavern that is run by angels. It appears when people need it, and the angels listen to the stories that people tell them. And so those are the stories of the anthology. Now, I've already put in all the stories that I've posted on Substack, and I'm at, 23,000 words already. And that's within just 1 month. And I've also been writing children's stories at the same time. So just the amount of words that I'm producing is insane. I never thought that this would be so easy. Not to mention that the other day I went out for a very long walk, like a 4-hour walk, and I recorded no less than 8 different short stories. So now I think I have about 14 stories that I've already developed that are ready to be posted. And I haven't even added to the anthology. So anyway, long story short, it's been an amazing experience. And I love Substack because it gives me a platform where I can very easily post this stuff. Now, if you're watching this on YouTube, you may have followed the early phases or the early stages of the creation of my novel. And then you just wondered, so what happened? Well, that's why I'm recording this show. It's to make you aware of the fact that I am actually already building this world for my readers. And if you didn't know that I had a Substack, now may be a very good moment to go over there and subscribe. And if you love fantasy, it is a fantastic place to be because there are lots and lots of fantasy authors, science fiction authors, storytellers like me who are posting their stories for free on Substack. So for me, it has become the go-to app. And there is a very supportive community. So it's a lot of fun. It's very similar to my YouTube community. around my booktube channel. Lots of encouragements and tips and ideas and suggestions. And it's just very compatible with what I was already doing on YouTube. So super happy to be on Substack. So go and take a look. It's very simple to find me there. It's just fatherroderick.substack.com. And if you subscribe, you can actually choose between two shows, or two, not shows. I'm still thinking as a podcaster. But there are two offers that I have, two newsletters. So there is the daily scroll. And that is basically, if you subscribe to that, you will get an email with that story of the day. And usually it's a story you can read in 5 minutes. So it's something you can just squeeze in your day, or maybe you're going through your email and you're bored and you just want to escape for a few minutes. Then that's why I wrote that email newsletter. So it's a new story every day. For a lot of people, that is way too much, of course. I can see that the opening rates are going down because people are falling behind. And so for those people, I created a second weekly email newsletter. So you can select either you want all of it, or you say, hey, just give me the weekly one. I will just go to Substack myself if I want to read a story. So the weekly Substack newsletter is called the Quill and Candle. It's kind of the name of a tavern where storytellers gather. And so the Quill and Tavern is, and that is actually based on this show that you're currently watching or listening to. So it's for people who don't have time to listen to podcasts or don't want to go watch this on YouTube. And that's perfectly fine. Some people are readers, some people are more like auditory learners like I am, and other people just like to watch. So anyway, I hope that kind of gives you an overview of what I've been up to as an author. And now I want to go to the second segment, and that is always going to be kind of a personal story of how one of those stories that I write every day, how one of those stories came about. Today, I would like to talk about one of the scariest stories that I've written so far. It's called The Leech. And it tells the story of an old nun who lives in one of those Irish monasteries, and her entire life she's been a caretaker. So she's been taking care of her mother, because at an older age, her mother was suffering from dementia. And so this sister has been taking care of her until her death. And then when her mother, was deceased, she decided to enter the monastery. But she had the heart of a caretaker, so she continues to take care of people and healing them, and she becomes quite well known in the region. So every day there are lots of sick people who show up at the gate to the monastery premises asking for this sister. And so Sister Siobhan, takes care of them. She knows how to brew all sorts of, healing potions. And she, in very difficult cases, she also has a very old leather prayer book that was handed over from generation to generation. It was written by the original founder of the monastery. It was this holy nun who just wrote these beautiful prayers. And so she has a lot of tools to her disposition to help people. But then one day, there is this young woman that shows up. And what is immediately strange is that the woman is completely soaked, as if she's been underwater, which in fact is exactly what happened. So she was traveling, she tells the sister, and she had to cross a river, but the river was much deeper than she anticipated. And then when she stepped out of the river, she felt very sick. And she was traveling, but the more she traveled, the worse she felt. And that's when she saw the monastery, and here we are. The sister examines her and at first can't really determine what is going on. And so she tries a potion, but the potion doesn't help. And then she examines the girl physically, and she discovers that glued to the back of this young woman is this leech. It's not a small leech, no, it is as big as a hand, and it's pulsating, and it's just draining the woman of energy. Now, I told you this was a scary story. And then the sister is trying to somehow get rid of the leech, but it's very difficult. The leech is almost a supernatural being, and very stuck. So she tries various remedies and ultimately manages to get rid of the leech. You have to read the story to know how. But then this young woman keeps returning to the monastery, and she gets very leechy. She becomes a stalker, and every time she's like, "Okay, you need to help me more," or she starts to accuse the sister. You didn't really heal me because I'm still really feeling terrible, or you robbed me from my money while I was recovering, and it gets worse and worse. And the sister, this poor old sister, she gets just so scared that she barely dares to go outside anymore, because every time she walks outside of her cell, that woman is waiting for her. And so anyway, that's kind of the gist of the story. It has a very scary ending as well, so go check that out on my Substack. But the reason why I wrote this story is something I wanted to share with you today, and that is because this has happened several times in my life as a priest. As a priest, of course, I'm also, in a certain way, a caretaker. I'm not a physician, obviously, but people come to me for advice, for help, for, to be consoled if there's something happening in their lives. And I love that. I think that's part of my work as a shepherd, to take care of my flock and to help people and to listen to them. However, I've been a priest for many years. Every once in a while, someone will take advantage of that. Someone will latch on to you and won't let go. And that has happened to me 3 times in my life at a very worrying degree, where those people have latched onto me, started to stalk me, and made me feel very unsafe, because they could be anywhere. They show up at your door. They're waiting for you at the end of Mass, completely, taking all your attention, requesting that they need to be helped because, they are the only thing in the world that matters. And, obviously these people do suffer from certain ailments or problems, but it's because of their situation that they don't realize that they are draining me or any other caretaker of all their energy, and there's no more room for anyone else. And I know from personal experience that can become very, first it's very heavy. It weighs on you. You keep thinking of the situation, because those people usually tell you a lot of very dramatic stories. But then they also make you feel like you are the only one who can save them. And especially when I was a younger priest, I kind of fell for that. I had this Messiah complex that, yeah, I have to take care of this person. I have to be always available day and night, because what will happen if I am not, And of course, that's such a pitfall, and it happens to a lot of caretakers. But it's even more tricky when you're a priest, because obviously most priests are celibate priests. They live alone, so they don't have that kind of back channel where you can discuss this with someone else and ask for advice. Now, obviously, I do have colleagues, but they are sometimes also kind of, their hands are tied. What are you going to do? And so, at 3 times in my life, I had to deal with that. One very recently, and I can tell you that it is incredibly scary at one point. It does really make you kind of worry about going outside and going to church, because who knows, that person might show up again. And um, it's something that I think I'm handling better than I used to in the past, because now I'm just looking at it from the outside. I have my boundaries, and if someone, continuously, despite me expressing these boundaries and saying, "Hey, stop! This is all I can do for you. Go find help elsewhere." If people don't respect those boundaries, then it's very simple. It's transgression, and it is potentially also something that is punishable by law. And so I go to the police, and the police, acts upon that. That's never fun, It's never something you want to do, especially as a priest. But sometimes you have to protect yourself because you also are supposed to take care of others. Like your boundaries are there, not just to keep other people out, but also to protect the people that you want to let in. And so that is actually the real life experience that I wanted to put into this story. And the question that I then ask as a writer is, okay, I have this issue, and I think I'm not the only one who has experienced this at one point in their life. Um, how can I give that a spin? How can I tell a story in a fantasy world that would deal with this? And then obviously the metaphor was pretty easy, a leech. And then what? So how is that leech going to interact with the characters in my story? And that's how I came up with the story, The Leech. So it's a metaphor of basically of stalking behavior and what it does to you as a caretaker. And I've noticed that every time I tell a story about something that touches me personally, the story is so much better. It's very easy to come up with a children's story about a dog running around with a chihuahua looking for pizza in Rome because, yeah, I don't have a personal issue with dogs, nor with pizza, nor with Rome. But when these stories come closer to home and kind of touch upon things that are getting under my skin, those stories become much more real and, I don't know, better. I don't know, of course, if that translates to the reader. I don't know if that story, it works for me. I don't know if it works for my readers, but it is something that I've learned also to do in my novel. So my main characters in my novel are a young novice, a male novice called Ty, and Orla, who's a young nun, also a novice in a monastery. And I wanted to create a backstory for them. And so I wrote a backstory. I'm not sure if I'm going to integrate it in the book, but you have to know your characters before you can let them go on an adventure. And a lot of their backstory is composed of my own experiences and experiences of people that I know very well and what they've gone through. And that makes it easier to a certain extent to write realistic characters that behave realistically and whose traumas and struggles are real and not just made up, even though they are made up. But I guess you see what I mean. So anyway, that's a little bit of the backstory of how I am learning to write from the heart. And this is new. This is because normally I wouldn't really talk about those things. Um, Except for with a spiritual advisor or with my doctor or in confession or something like that. But I've noticed that writing and fantasy writing can be an outlet, can also be a way for me to process those complicated feelings around issues that I come across in my life. And hopefully it will be helpful also to other people who might recognize a little bit of their own lives in there. What else are we going to do today? Well, as promised, I'm also going to give you a quick overview of the stories that I wrote this week. So those of you that are just listening to this show or watching it on YouTube and you don't have time to read every story every single day of the week, that at least you have a bit of a sample and then you can just pick and choose the stories that appeal to you. So let me take a look at my page here. The last story since last Sunday. On June the 1st, I wrote a story that I loved writing. It's called The Girl Who Drew the World. And it's about this, they're two sisters. And they live in a small cottage, and the younger sister loves flowers. And then she finds this very mysterious quill and or feather. Actually, she turns it into a quill, and then she starts to paint these flowers. And her older sister is like, yeah, but she's a bit jealous because she's not that artistic. And then she challenges her younger sister, well, can you also come up with something that is not a copy of what is real? And then the next day, whatever the younger sister has drawn has become true, becomes a reality. And so the older sister is, well, We could have money, we could have a castle, we could have suitors, we could have, a tavern and food and nice clothes. And so she pushes the younger sister to create a lot of new things. And then, of course, at one point, the younger sister breaks and walks away. So the older sister picks up the quill. And then, of course, all hell breaks loose. So that's the first story. The second story I wrote on June the 2nd is also a story that is dear to my heart. It's The Pie Runner. It's a story about a young boy in Ireland who is running because he loves running and he's very good at it. And he is helping an older baker, or a woman baker, and her knees are troubling her. So he does the deliveries of the warm pies, and everybody is of course happy to see him. It's like the pizza deliveries today. You're like, you hear the bell and you're like, oh, pizza. And so this young boy just runs around. Everybody knows him, and they give him more and more stuff to do, like carrying around the mail and everything. And then at one point, someone tells him, hey, why don't you just participate in one of those games? There are these athletic games that were also happening in the Middle Ages, for real. I'm not making this up. And so he enters his first running contest, and it becomes addictive, and he starts running and running and running. But of course, time also keeps running. You can't outrun time. At one point in his life, he's old, and running becomes really hard. And then one morning, he is running his usual round, and he sees someone running just ahead of him. And it's this young boy. And he's like, he's speeding up. He's trying to catch up with the boy, and he can't. And then the next day, there's someone else running there, a bit older, and he's also trying to, and he never really catches up with these people running in front of him. Well, there's a reason for that. Read the story on my Substack if you want to know how that ends. Then the third story, also a lot of fun, also a fantasy story. It's called The Truffle Hog. And I don't know how I came up with this, but I just all of a sudden got this mental image of a pig looking for truffles. And then I asked, well, what if instead of a truffle, it would find treasure? And what treasure would that be? And so I developed a whole story about this man who buys a truffle hog, trying to find truffles, but he finds these vials with strange magical liquid in it. And he's very curious, but also a bit apprehensive. And then at one point, he just gives a little bit of that liquid to the hog, and the hog then starts to discover treasure. And if he tries another vial, the hog will find something else. That doesn't end well. So that's the story of the truffle hog. And then I wrote a small story. This was also a bit of a challenge that I set myself. It's one of those stories for the children's book about Saint Agnes. Saint Agnes is a very famous saint in Rome. She was a young girl who was captured by men and suffered horrible things. I won't go into detail, but you kind of can imagine. But she kept praying. She kept telling her capturers that her heart belonged to God, and they end up killing her. It's a very gruesome story. She was a martyr. And today there's still a church that is dedicated to her memory and sisters, and every year they bring 2 lambs to those sisters, and they're sheared, and that wool is used to create these insignias that archbishops wear as a sign of them being a shepherd. And then my question, or what triggered the story, was, well, what if I tell the story of those lambs? And then I wanted to tell the story of Saint Agnes as well, but it's for children, so I cannot really go into the gruesome details. So how do I honor the story of Saint Agnes, but write it in such a way that children can understand what's going on without being overly, traumatized by the story? I think it turned out well. So it's called Agnes and the Little Lamb. And then the next day, as a contrast, I wrote The Leech, which is the story that I just described in detail. And today, the day that I'm recording this, I wrote another story about an animal in Rome. And this is a story of this tiny little elephant that was immortalized by Bernini as a statue, a marble statue, very close to the Pantheon in Rome. And the statue of that little elephant has a huge Egyptian obelisk on top of the elephant. It's a very weird statue. And I always wondered, because I studied in Rome, so I saw it a lot. It's like, what? Why? What is the idea behind this thing? Now, apparently, it's just a symbolic thing of basically the elephant stands for the progress of Christianity, and the obelisk for the pagan religions that were then kind of superseded by Christianity, something like that. Not a very compelling story. And so I figured, well, you know what? It's time to tell the story of that little elephant. And so I wrote the story Hannibal's Last Elephant, connecting it to the famous story of Hannibal, who crossed the Alps with all these elephants to scare the Romans. And he wanted to go to Rome, never got there. But then I just imagined that that little elephant was part of the elephants of Hannibal. Um, and I'm very happy with the outcome. It's a charming little story. So go and check it out. Again, the address is fatherroderick.substack.com. And now it's time for the final segment of this show, and that is always a little review of a book, a fantasy book that I've been enjoying recently. Now, as you know, I read a lot of books. I try to read 150 books each year, so that means I read about 3 books per week. Not always fantasy, by the way. I also read a lot of nonfiction. But today's book that I wanted to recommend is a Japanese book. It's called The Cat Who Saved Books by Susuke Natsukawa. I hope I pronounced that correctly. My Japanese is a bit rusty. And it has a cat and it has books. It's got a bookstore. So it kind of immediately evokes cozy fantasy. What I love about this book is it is a collection of short stories. But there is also a frame story, so that may sound familiar. That's exactly what I do with my anthology of stories, but it doesn't feature cats. But in this story, the author does something I think really smart. So it's a modern day story. There's this boy or young man who inherits the bookstore of his grandfather. The thing is, he has nothing with books. He's not interested in books. But he just does what he needs to do as the grandchild and wants to honor his grandfather. And so he just takes care of the bookshop and people just come and buy books. But then one day there's this tabby cat who shows up. I think his name is Tiger. And the tabby cat can speak. And he tells him, I need you for a very important mission. And then the young man is like, okay. And then the cat takes him inside one of those stories. And there, the young man has to solve various threats to the world of books and reading. But it's all like these fantasy tales of, for instance, a king who wants to destroy all books. And then he has to save the day somehow. And there is always a kind of metaphorical aspect to those stories. So there's always a kind of an underlying message. And it all has to do with the importance of storytelling. I really enjoyed this book. I love the style. It's very Japanese in the sense that there are quite a few novels today, fiction novels, fantasy novels even, where it's very similar to what I love in anime or certain anime series, where it's almost like slice of life. There's not much happening. It's a bit like magical realism. But it's not really the kind of structure you will find in a lot of Western fantasy stories where there's the protagonist, there's a problem, there's a call to action, story beats, and then there's the big finale. And now this is more like, okay, let me take you inside a world and let's just look around and see what we discover. And like when I was reading this book, I felt like I was there. And I don't even remember exactly the clue of some of these stories or how it ended. What I do remember is how the book made me feel and how every time I was reading a few more chapters, I felt like I'd been in Japan. I'd been on this crazy fantasy adventure somewhere else. And it's just a genre that I really, really, really love. So highly recommend it. And that wraps it up for today's show of the Quill and Candle. I'm so glad that you wandered in and hopefully you enjoyed it. Again, final reminder, if you want to check out my stories or read like a summary of this podcast or this video, make sure to subscribe to my Substack. It's totally free. It's fatherroderick.substack.com. Of course, if you're watching this on YouTube, you may want to subscribe to this YouTube channel if you haven't done so already. And I really welcome your suggestions, your comments, your questions. Ask me anything. And especially if you have any tips of fantasy books that you think I might enjoy, please leave them in the comments. And one final thing, I also am working on a new project, a storytelling project that I hope to also deploy on TikTok. I don't have a book talk channel yet, but I want to create one. And the idea is, and let me know in the comments what you think of this. It was like, okay, so I write these stories every day. What if one of those stories, for instance, on Friday or Saturday, is a story that I create with my listeners, with my readers? And it will be kind of like choose your own adventure. So I'll start telling a new story at the beginning of the month. And then at the end of the first segment, I say, okay, so what happens next? There are 3 objects here. There's a candle, there's a sword, and there is a jug of beer. Which object do you want me to pick up, or the protagonist to pick up? And that will influence the rest of the story. Or there are 3 doors, one on the left, one on the right, and one in front of you. Which door should I go through? Or something even more specific. And then the idea is that people can let me know how they want the story to continue, and the option that gets the most votes will be the one that I pick. And so I don't know where the story is going. That's going to be part of the fun. It's going to be a story in 4 or 5 chapters every month. So it will ultimately be a short story, like a proper short story, not just a flash fiction story. But I will create it with you. And then I think I should also kind of leave people the opportunity to just come up with something else that might happen. And might pick that if it's original enough. Let me know if that appeals to you and if you would like to participate. Because, I don't think I'm going to start this when everybody tells me, oh, nobody got time for that. So I'd be really glad to see some of those reactions. Thank you so much for the privilege of your time. I'm signing off now. If you want to support me, just go to fatherroderick.com/join. Everything I do, my writing, my social media work, it's all based on donations. I don't have a salary as a priest because I don't work in a parish. I just help out here. So if you want to help me keep the lights on and continue to create these stories and these videos, then again, fatherroderick.com/join. I would really appreciate it. Talk to you next week. Take care.